It's 2 years later than originally planned and in a different country, but finally it's happening. My name is Bernadette Fischler-Hooper, and I'm the head of international advocacy with WWF UK. And I'm joined here with fantastic WWF colleagues. And here is what we're going to do today. So first, I will tell you a bit about the mission for the Global Biodiversity Framework, why it's so important and what needs to happen to make a nature-positive world reality. Then I will pass on to my colleague, Vishesh Uppal, who is the Director of Governance, Law and Policy with WWF India, and also our expert on DSI, which is one of the hottest topics here at COP15. Afterwards, we have Guido Broekhoven. He is the Head of Policy Research and Development with WWF International, and he will update us on the state of play when it comes to goals and targets. And then we will hear from Florian Titze. He's the Policy Advisor for International Biodiversity, WWF Germany, and our resident expert on finance, and that's another hot topic at COP15. So we will each regale you for 5 minutes on our topics, and then we will have time for question and answers. Right. Without much further ado, let me kick off. So, one of our top priorities for the Global Biodiversity Framework is to see a clear, inspiring, and of course ambitious mission for 2030. This is important because we need to see a clear articulation of what this bundle of goals and targets is supposed to ultimately up to. So what's the guiding light? What's the overall aim? What's the mission that this framework is going to inspire to? And we believe, and luckily so do many parties, that the mission should be to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030 to achieve a nature-positive world. Simply put, it should be our mission to have more nature in 2030 than there was in 2020. And we need more nature because nature is the source of our health, our security, and our prosperity. Just halting the loss is not enough. Frankly, I personally think we have lost too much nature already anyway. So if you look at WWF's Living Planet report that was launched a couple of months ago, it revealed the sheer scale of nature loss, with an average of 69% decline in the size of global wildlife populations since 1970. And that's only a little bit more than my lifetime. So that's definitely shocking. And the other thing that's important about the mission is that it is easy to communicate, that it's inspiring and aspirational. And we think that halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity to achieve a nature-positive world fits that bill perfectly. At the end of the day, these goals and targets will only remain words on papers unless they're implemented. And having an inspiring mission that can rally both public as well as political momentum and support will help with that implementation. So now the big question is, are we going to get it? Well, world leaders have already stated time and time again that they support the ambition to halt and reverse nature loss. That happened in various statements, from the Leaders' Pledge for Nature to the Climate COP in Glasgow to G20 and G7, but most importantly also in the Kunming Declaration, which was the result of COP 15.1 a year ago. But however, here in Montreal on the eve of COP15, some countries are still hesitant to sign up to this challenge, but we firmly believe nothing less is required to pull our planet back from the brink. Well, in short, as it stands at the moment, the stakes are really high and time is running out. The lack of progress during the open-ended Working Group 5, which resulted in a draft text that's far from workable and does not really instill confidence that countries will grab this once-in-a-decade opportunity and agree on an ambitious framework. And now that COP15 kicks off for real, the Chinese presidency, the co-chairs, the co-leads, really everybody needs to absolutely supercharge this process and make sure that these negotiations start delivering ambitious results. It is no longer an option to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Going into COP15, negotiators have one task: up the ambition and lower the word count. And of course, to agree a mission to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030 for a nature-positive world. Well, that's enough for now on the mission. Let's pick up one of the hot potatoes of these negotiations, which is DSI. And I throw the hot potato over to Vishesh, please.
Thank you, Bernadette. Hi, everyone. I'm Vishesh. So, as Bernadette said, it is a hot potato, but there has been some progress on the discussions about benefit sharing from digital sequence information linked to genetic resources. The open ended working group 5 has managed to compile some building blocks or elements for taking the discussion further. Since this document we feel would be a good basis to start the negotiations in the COP. Some positives in the document are the emphasis that the benefits from digital sequence information on genetic resources should be used to support conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and that the main recipients of such benefits need to be indigenous people and local communities who are the custodians of resources and associated traditional knowledge. The text also explicitly recognizes the rights of indigenous people and local communities, including the traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources that they hold. In addition, there's a clear recognition that capacity building, technology transfer, technical and scientific cooperation, or to support access to is required, on analysis and use of the digital sequence information on genetic resources. WWF firmly believes that the only way to achieve a just future for our planet and people is by ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from use of biodiversity and or associated traditional knowledge. Therefore, the global biodiversity framework must give equal emphasis to the third objective of the convention. The framework must also ensure that we secure an increase in benefit sharing, both monetary and non monetary, from any utilization of genetic resources. Therefore, we really need an agreement and a recommendation on how to address digital sequence information on genetic resources in the context of the post 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Yes, I said there is some progress. However, we are concerned that there's a long way still to go, as the entire text is still to be negotiated, and a mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources is to be agreed and put in place. We are, however, hopeful that the document which the open ended working group has developed will be a good basis for negotiations at the COP, and that the COP will be able to come to a good agreement which is supported by all parties. Thank you. Over to Guido.
Thanks, Vishesh. Sorry. I just wanted to thank you for your intervention. Very straight and to the point. Good to hear some positives, and there's still a long way to go, as you say, since the entire mechanism still needs to be negotiated. But there's still hope that we get to a just future, to a just future for climate and people that will ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits. Sorry for the interruption. I will now immediately hand over to Guido Broekhoven, and he will talk to us about the state of play on targets and goals.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a bit of good news. We did see considerable progress and consensus on the need to firmly integrate a rights-based approach into the framework. That's particularly relevant for the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands and territories, and also in relation to integrating a gender approach in the framework. That's very important. However, we believe it's a very meager result after 3 days of intense negotiations. Parties failed to agree on even some of the most fundamental elements of the framework text. There are actually 2 versions of the document on the table, and parties kept on going back and forth between the 2 versions. There are still discussions about the structure of the framework, with negotiations about whether certain sections should be integrated or kept separate. The nature and focus of some of the sections are still under discussion, particularly as it relates to this section B bis, which could focus on the premises, principles, or guidelines. There's no agreement on that yet. Also, the nature of the goals is still under discussion. Will they provide sort of aspirational guidance to 2050, thereby sort of kicking down the road measurable outcomes to a later stage, or will they include measurable outcomes so that parties know where they stand by 2030? As a result of these discussions, these lengthy discussions, some of the other really basic issues in the framework didn't get enough time. Ambition on conservation was only discussed at a very cursory level. The target of 30 by 30 was not even discussed, and also ambition on restoration was pushed forward to further discussions at the COP itself. On sustainable use, parties did have a discussion, but progress was indeed very slow. We believe that parties need to commit to halving the footprint of production and consumption, underpinned by very ambitious targets to transform the productive sectors that drive biodiversity loss. Agriculture is responsible for 70% of biodiversity loss, and we need to see strong and ambitious targets to transform agriculture and food systems. At the beginning of this process, a few years ago, parties agreed that weak implementation was a key reason why the previous targets, the Aichi targets, were not agreed. However, discussions on the implementation mechanism and how to strengthen it have been consistently plagued by a lack of time. And also in the working group discussions that have just been concluded, they were not on the table. And we're really concerned that discussions on how to improve the implementation that will enable parties to take stock during implementation and then ratchet up action over time to stay on course to achieve agreed goals and targets, that there will be insufficient time to discuss and agree on all the details needed to put in place such an implementation mechanisms. Also, the role of business was discussed, but there's no agreement on how to change the course of business from harming nature to investing in nature positive activities. So we believe really that parties are playing with fire and they really need to change tack. They need to keep the eye on the ball, which is really to arrive at agreeing an ambitious framework that is commensurate with the scale and the urgency of the biodiversity crisis. What they need to start doing is they need to start to negotiate. They need to start lifting the brackets. And essentially what we need to see is fewer words, but more ambition and more urgency. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Guido. So as you can see, also there's a little bit of progress, but by far not enough. Huge tasks are still outstanding. Important topics like ambition on restoration and other things have not been discussed. And fundamental questions have not yet been answered, like the nature of the goals and others. And the big question, how all of this will be implemented, might not have enough time to be discussed. Thanks a lot for your insights. I will now pass on to Florian, who is going to talk to us about another hot potato, or maybe a hot chestnut if you want, which is finance.
Thank you, Bernadette. Good morning, everyone. I'm Florian Tietze, Policy Advisor for International Biodiversity Policy and responsible for the financing negotiations for WWF. Let me start with this. Financing is always the Achilles heel of every global agreement. And it's very clear, and I think that's also very clear to everyone in the negotiation rooms, that we will never be able to agree to an ambitious global biodiversity framework, and we will never be able to implement it, if we even agree, if there's not enough financing commitments on the table and as part of that agreement. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that yet. We are really worried, we are really concerned that financing could be the issue that unrails these negotiations at the end, and that will keep us from successfully agreeing an ambitious framework, in addition to some of the other elements that my colleagues have mentioned. And we really need countries to do more here. We need to have more ambition, we need to have more dialogue, and we need to have more progress in these financing negotiations. In the last 3 days at the open-ended working group, only a few elements were actually a part of these negotiations. But even in these, we could see all the dynamic that has kept us from making progress in these negotiations so far. We have made no progress, and we have basically put a few paragraphs that were in a discussion into a huge chaotic part of the text that reflects the disagreement, the large divide between the countries on financing. But what's needed? What do we have to have in the final agreement on financing and the financing package so we can have a successful agreement and successful implementation. And this whole thing can be summarized basically with two things, and that is financing green and greening finance. And starting with financing green, of course, and that's, I think, very clear to everyone, is that we need to have more money on the table. We need to have more financial resources to implement the framework. And it's very important to say that the financial resources need to come from all sources. We need to leverage all sources that are available and that can support the agreement and the implementation of the framework. And that is domestic financing in national budgets in every country to implement the difficult measures in that country. The second is international financing, including official development aid. So support, financial support from the countries of the global north to those countries that urgently need support in the successful implementation. And the third one is the huge potential of private financing that we need to leverage, that is urgently needed to also get us to an amount of financing that is enough for successful implementation. Coming to the other side, greening finance, that is something that is often not reflected appropriately in the discussions, is that we will never be able to successfully implement if we're also not addressing those investments in the private financial markets, in our economies, that are contributing to the destruction of nature, harming nature. So we need to address basically the financing equations from both sides, reducing the negative financial flows and increasing those to implement the framework. And on the latter part, which I want to be clear because this is sometimes not well understood, is that as part of reducing the harmful flows, that is in the public sector and the private sector. So we need to address, for example, harmful subsidies, something that the Aichi targets 12 years ago already had agreed. We haven't done any progress on that. But also we need to address the financial markets, the finance sector, where we need urgently to have regulation and measures to ensure that basically our entire economy is not contributing and harming nature, but supporting its conservation and restoration. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Florian. I'm sure many of you will agree that finance is indeed a make or break issue for the global biodiversity framework, and also an extremely divisive issue, which even increases the concerns that we have. And not enough progress has been made, and we clearly need to see a step change to see both the governments and private sector and everybody to both start financing green and to have green finance. Thank you very much. So as you can tell, we think that this summit is a chance that the world must not miss, and it is probably the last best chance for governments to turn things around for nature and to rescue our precious life support system. We now have some time for questions. I will first go to the journalists here in the room, and then we will also go online if there are any questions there. Can I see an indication? There's a gentleman here with a, I want to say green lanyard, but everybody has that.
Hello, good morning everyone. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm a journalist of online news portal jagonews24.com. I have a question for you all, because Bangladesh is a cultivate prime country. So there is a lot of cultural activities there, and they are using lots of environmental things that harmful our cultivation and biodiversity. So what should we do, and what can do our world leader to increase the biodiversity hamper? Is it okay?
I believe I have understood the question. Is the question that what can be done to, particularly in the context of Bangladesh, increase biodiversity? Yes, okay. So the quick answer from my side would be to get everybody from leaders to the general population to sign up to the idea to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030 and to get to a nature-positive world. I'm looking to my colleagues Vishash and Guido if either of you want to add a little bit further.
More or less the same as what you said, Bernadette, but I think, you have local communities who are also conserving on the ground. So I think it's important that the government actually takes in everyone and, actually helps promote conserving local resources as well as sustainable use. I think that's a long way, will go a long way for Bangladesh. Thanks.
Thanks. Another element that is probably very important in this context is the use of nature-based solutions to address societal challenges, including climate change, which is, of course, important for many countries, including Bangladesh. And we are advocating for a strong reference to nature-based solutions as a mechanism to achieve both biodiversity conservation and other goals, to have that strongly embedded in the framework. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions, the gentleman with the beard and the lady next to him. Let's take them both and then answer those.
Hi, Jack Graham, Thomson Reuters Foundation. This is a question for Florian, but comments would be welcome elsewhere. I was wondering if countries aren't willing to put more money on the table with stringent national finances, where can the cash come from? And is it realistic that there will be a financial settlement if they're standing their ground? And also, I was wondering, in the connection between climate and nature, is there some room for redirecting some of that climate finance, which is obviously far larger than what's on offer for nature?
I can go as well. Gloria Dickey with Reuters News Agency. You mentioned that 30 by 30 was not even discussed in the meeting over the past few days. I'm wondering if you could maybe explain why that was. Was it simply a matter of time? And whether there's any indication that some of those ambitions might be being watered down, particularly when it comes to oceans?
Great. Maybe, Guido, can you take that last question first, and then over to you, Florian?
Yeah, the reason why it wasn't discussed was partly procedural, because in the previous round of negotiations in Nairobi, parties didn't have time to cover all aspects of the framework. So it was decided to start the meeting here with these elements that were not yet discussed in Nairobi. And as a result, they ran out of time to revisit some of the elements that were discussed in Nairobi. In terms of the actual negotiations about the target itself, I think there are still different options and views on the table. So we'll really need to see when the negotiations start in earnest on this issue, what the various positions will be at that time. Thanks.
Thank you. On the first two questions, well, one of the challenges is that biodiversity conservation isn't yet prioritized enough by governments. And with that lack of a prioritization, political will, there's also a lack of willingness on committing enough financing. And I think that has to change. That's why also it's so important to have leaders here and have leaders commit and really show their support to it. And then it will become more likely to also have the financial support. That is also why I mentioned that we need to leverage all sources that are available. And that is, of course, in all countries, domestic resource mobilization, and in addition, international financing from the global north to the global south. And private financing plays a huge role. I also want to mention one thing that is very important when we're talking about scarce resources for implementation, and that is policy coherence. One of the major challenges that we're facing right now is that many governments are, on the one side, spend or mobilize financing for the implementation, so to conserve nature. And on the other side, they're investing a lot of money in things that harm nature. So that's basically not very wise economic policy. So this needs to be thought of together, and that's why we're advocating for a comprehensive package that takes both of these things into account, as I said, financing green and greening finance. To address the second question, which is also a very important one, how can we leverage climate finance? One thing is that Guido also mentioned before, nature-based solutions are ways to both address the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, because there are tremendous synergies. That's also spending the money efficiently. We need to be a bit careful, though, because we cannot use, and that is sometimes a criticism for climate finance, we cannot double count. Not every dollar or euro invested in climate also counts the same for biodiversity. So there is a fine line, but the synergies are important, need to be used.
Thanks a lot. I'm super mindful of time. I presume you're standing there because you also have a question, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I just want to quickly check with my colleague. Do we have any online questions as well? No. Okay, great. So anybody else who still wants to? There's 2 questions. Okay, 3 questions. Then we have to be quick. Let's start with you and the gentleman who's behind you, and we'll try to be as quick as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Eric Pierre Champagne from La Presse. It's a French newspaper in Montreal. I want to know what, in your point of view, what is the main difficulty to get a deal on a framework at the end of this COP? What is the main difficulty did you identify?
Okay, thanks a lot. That was great. Short question. Please, what's yours?
Hi, Jacob Sebrin, the Canadian Press. This was touched on a little bit earlier, but all of the targets for 2020, none of them were met. Why do you think they all failed? And what can be done differently this time so that some of the targets are met?
Thanks a lot. And you here?
CFAC Radio from Sherbrooke University. My question is about gender equity. Do you have any progress? That's the first question. And other one is maybe a bit stupid, but there's no stupid question, just stupid answer, so I will ask it. So what we don't declare a ceasefire for economic war and military war for the next 7 years, because we are in climate and biodiversity emergency, and what we don't put it in the text as a first requirement. So, and I want to ask, COP27, the priority was to reparation for poor countries, or should we do restriction for the developed country to reduce their contamination, or she should pay?
Okay, thanks.
What is
Sorry,
the priority?
we have 2 minutes now to answer. So I suggest that Guido is going to quickly, in 1 sentence, answers what's the main difficulty and why the targets failed so far. Vishaj, are you okay to say 1 sentence about gender? Then we're going to step aside. We're happy to answer any further questions in the corridor. You can just pick us up, but we're going to be leaving in 1 minute. So very quickly over to you, Guido and Vishaj.
Thank you. I think the main stumbling block is to achieve an agreement that is ambitious across the board, ambitious on conservation, ambitious on sustainable use, on equitable and fair benefit sharing, and on resource mobilization that matches that ambition on the other 3 objectives. The reasons why Aichi targets failed was the lack of political commitment and accountability to hold governments account.
Yeah, so I think the gender target was actually one of the positive outcomes because it was a clean text till we reached the final plenary. So it's unfortunate that a certain wording has got bracketed, but I'm hopeful because everyone is rallying around it, and I'm hopeful that in the COP we will have a good support for the gender target, and we will have a good clean text.
Thanks so much. That's it from us for today. As we said, we will be available to answer your questions on the site, but we have to finish now because this is over. Tap us on the shoulder. We are totally available, or contact our press colleagues as well. Yes, that's really it. As I said, this is probably the last best chance for governments to turn things around, and we really hope they take it. Thank you very much and goodbye.